So one of the nice things about having a YouTube channel is you sometimes get to start conversations with other interesting YouTubers. I already got to know Marcus from Not Right Music, who's been kind enough to preview scripts and chat through ideas before I make some of my videos. And recently I've been chatting with Lazzio at Signal's music studio, who seems to have such a positive spirit and has some great music theory videos on everything from polymeters to Picardy thirds. His recent video on Dorian mode, for example, was just one of the clearest expositions of what that mode is, how to use it. There was lots of great examples and so on. So I really recommend checking out his channel. We got chatting originally when Jake asked me the question of what it means to be a composer and what that even is. So I thought I'd make this video all about what a composer is, how you become a composer, how you get commissions, how you make your living, and what it's like to be a composer. So of course there are lots of different ways you can make music. And composer is as good a name as any for someone who creates music, whatever the form it is. You know, you can make up music by playing it with your friends, you can improvise, you can record with a laptop or in a studio, or like me, you can write it down and get others to play it later. So I personally explored most of these options at one time or another. At school, I formed bands and started writing my own songs in my early teens. I remember, for example, having a specific shaker pattern in mind, so I wrote it down on some manuscript paper and gave it to the drummer of my band, who just squirmed at the idea of following the details of what I'd written down there. So I quickly got drawn towards ensembles who are more used to reading what you'd written. There was a couple of ensembles at school that I started writing for, and there was something about that process, the sort of thought and consideration involved, that just worked for me. You know, I tried forming jazz bands, I tried using recording studios, but it was always that written approach that I kept coming back to. I suppose I'm trying to emphasize the fact that it wasn't so much the genre that drew me in as the technical method of creation that allowed me to spend my time on my own trying to get a musical thought down in a way that others could then perform. In fact, I didn't really start getting hooked on classical music until my late teens when I discovered Stravinsky. So with everything I'm about to say in this video, by and large, this is the way things work for people who call themselves contemporary classical composers. But all I really mean by that is composers whose preferred method of creating music is writing stuff down. There's a huge range of styles within that genre, from the steel pan pieces by Andy Akiho, through to the more cerebral sounds of Matthias Pintscher. And I'm not saying that you have to write stuff down to be a contemporary classical composer. I'm just saying that that's been the method I've preferred, and so that's the approach I can offer some insights into. So I went on to study music and composition at university, and the good thing about that is there's always some opportunities to get your work performed by student ensembles. In fact, I stayed in studies for as long as I could, doing a master's and a doctorate, and a large part of that was so that I could have access to those performing opportunities, to get the experience of converting dots on a page into vibrations in the air. Because that really is one of the challenges of being my kind of composer. I mean, if you're an artist, you make a painting, you have your finished work of art, so you know all you need is a canvas, some paints. But if you're a composer, you might spend 3 months working on a piece, but at the end you don't even have a piece of music, you just have a bunch of dots on a piece of paper. You still need the musicians, and you often need a rather rare and specialist breed of musician who can read your kind of music, which is often very difficult to play. And getting any of those kind of musicians together costs a huge amount of money. So you finish your studies and you find yourself out there in the big wide world. You can't afford your own musicians, so you need commissions from players, ensembles or orchestras. And the idea of getting commissions just seems impossible. So how does it happen? Well, I have to admit that it still feels like a miracle that it's happened to me to the extent it has. And many of my colleagues from studies have either given up or are struggling writing music that no one's playing. It's extremely hard and often very depressing. This is why people say you shouldn't do it unless you feel like you've got no choice. For me, there were two separate strands which both gradually expanded over time, one thing leading into another. First was my introduction to the opera scene. There's an experimental opera company called Tête à Tête in the UK who put out a call for new ideas for 10-minute operas. And I absolutely loved that whole world of writing music for the stage. And over time, I had a number of successful operas. My first full-scale one, still with Tête à Tête, was called Push. And then a few years later, The Firework Maker's Daughter for the Opera Group and the Royal Opera House. And finally, a couple of years ago, Nothing at Glyndebourne. At the same time as all that, I also got accepted from a call for scores that was put out by Carnegie Hall, which I talked about in a video before. And the contacts I met there led to all sorts of openings in the US, so for some time I had more commissions coming from the US than the UK. So the main lesson really in terms of how to get commissions is contacts. It may sound unfair, but in my experience, people almost always commission from people they know and have actually met personally. If you think about it, a new commission is always a big gamble for the institution, not just the commission fee, but the cost of putting on the concert, the rehearsals. So they have to be incredibly cautious. And if they've looked you in the eye and they know you're a reliable sort of person, well, that's half the battle. Making contacts while you're a student is an ideal way to start. Unfortunately for me, I wasn't really at that stage. I was still working out who I was and what I wanted to do. So I didn't really make a lot of useful contacts amongst players that I could lean on once I left. But there's certainly a lot of very successful composers that have done just that. They start by building a network of friends who then go on to play their work. Of course, my Carnegie Hall break was a competition entry, so I can't rule out completely the idea of entering competitions as a way of getting your first break. Making a living as a composer is of course very difficult, and the vast majority end up doing other work to supplement any income they're lucky enough to get from composing. And the vast majority of those are involved in academic teaching of one kind or another. In my case, I had a parallel interest in computer programming. As a kid, I used to sell computer games on the local market, and when the internet came along, I really loved the ability it gave you to be entrepreneurial without having to leave your bedroom. I set up a number of websites, and one in particular, the sheet music website 8notes.com, flourished. It's been going for almost 20 years now, and it offers arrangements of different popular classical and traditional pieces. And that, together with other work, has provided me with a solid basis to make a living alongside my composing. And even though I've had a pretty good chain of composition commissions now for 10 years or more, I still try to treat any composition income mainly as a bonus. It is possible to make some real money from composing if you start having operas and orchestral pieces performed regularly. Between the performing rights money and the part hire money, you could make upwards of a couple of $1,000s per performance, so you can see how that could quickly start to add up. But there's maybe 20 or 30 composers in the world who are lucky enough to be in that position. The other aspect of being a composer that's challenging is managing the flow of commissions. When you start out, any commission feels like a dream come true, and knowing how difficult they are to come by, it still feels faintly ridiculous to me to refuse a commission. But that of course means that if they keep coming in, you can find yourself under a lot of pressure to get them all done, which has happened to me on a couple of times, and it can be very stressful. So then you start refusing work, and pretty quickly you find yourself with an empty diary, and then you start wondering, will anyone ever commission me again? So then you go back to accepting everything. And you end up in these waves of either too much work or not enough. It's very challenging to find the right balance. One other question I think it's always good to ask yourself as a composer is, who are you trying to impress and why? Are you writing the music for yourself, for the future, for your audience? I've noticed I do have a sort of ambivalent attitude to an audience's reaction. I mean, of course, it's nice if everyone cheers after your piece, but my own reactions tell me that that's not really the validation I'm after, so what is? I suppose I feel a bit torn because I think in my heart what I want to write is the most perfectly built object that I personally feel does all the best things I know music can do. I enjoy the impossible challenge of that. So in that sense, I'm writing for myself, or at least some imaginary perfect listener who will enjoy all those tiny details I spend hours crafting. But constantly nagging at me are my sense of what the people playing and commissioning the work will think. And that's because without them, I'll just be one of those people writing dots on pieces of paper. I need those people to turn my dots into music. I know that to create the music I want to create, I should be following my own interests and passions and thinking of nothing but that. But I also know that without the players and institutions to perform them, I won't be a composer in the true sense. A composer whose work never gets performed is barely a composer at all. At the very least, as those college friends of mine would testify, it's a very hard path to tread. Finally, I often get asked about other types of composing. Would I write for films? Would I write for theatre? That's another aspect that I've tried, but what I really enjoy is being fully in charge myself. In those genres, you always have a boss who's saying, no, we need it like this, we need it like that. And it's amazing, for example, in opera that although it's a huge collaboration with a lot of other people, it's basically the composer's vision at its heart. And that's what really stimulates me artistically, is when I'm in control of it. So I hope that was all of interest. Do let me know if you've got any questions or thoughts about what being a composer is. I was hoping to do another video sometime on what it means to be a classical musician. Does that mean anything? What are the distinctions? So let me know in the comments if you're interested in hearing about that. If you'd like to support the channel, do consider joining my patrons over at Patreon, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.
You are the finest girl that I've ever known. I'm gonna love you for the rest of my life. I'm gonna keep you talking with your C-bone, 'cause I love you like a fuck with a spoon. I know your daddy's always gonna miss you. We'll tell your daddy you will do what you like. Tell him whatever he says.